Hello everyone, and welcome to the StartWell 2021 online event. This is the interactive session, the question and answer session. I'm Sharada Deepak. I'm the StartWell lead for the Southeast Division, and I'll be hosting the event today. And the StartWell organizing committee comprises of myself, my lovely Southeast Division manager, Karen Morgan, and Dr. Hassanan Altar, who's helped put together this program. And before we start the event, I've got some housekeeping rules, so I'm going to read them out. So firstly, this session is for the questions and your queries to be answered. Hopefully all of you would have had a chance to go through the video modules, and you're very welcome to ask your questions using the chat function or just raise your hand, and we'll ask you to come on and put your question to the speaker. Some of you have sent your questions beforehand, and we'll address them today as well. This session is being recorded, and if you do not wish to be recorded, please could you turn your camera off. And a link to the recording will be sent to the delegates within the next week. You may need to adjust how you view this meeting to get the best out of it, and you can do that by pressing the 3 dots across the bar. And if there are any technical issues, could you please drop a line in the chat? Karen and Chesney will pick that up and they'll get in touch with you. The feedback is really important to us, so I would advise you to please complete the feedback form and send it over to us. And you will be sent a feedback form from today's event as well. Certificates will be issued to you automatically by email, so ensure your email address is correct, along with your membership details, and this will be after the question and answer session. And those delegates who are unable to join today will need to watch the recording later, and then they'll get their certificates. Some of the speakers have agreed for the presentation slides to be passed on to the delegates, so this will be sent over to you in PDF format. And without much ado, we can now move on to the question and answer session. Before we start, I did want to say a huge thank you to all our speakers who have given up their time and resources to help put together this program. And obviously this isn't a live event on stage, but I would encourage you all to kind of, a huge round of applause for our speakers. Thank you so much. I do have some questions which have been sent by the delegates, but if you are able to let us know and join if you have any more. Our first speaker in the module, Dr. Adrian James, the President of the Royal College of Psychiatrists, couldn't be with us today, but we have sent over the questions to him and he's sent his response. So what I'll be doing is reading them out first. If there are any other questions, please do add them in the chat. This was a question by someone who didn't want to be named, and this was, thank you for sharing your experience with depression. It was really enlightening to hear that. I have recently taken on more leadership roles within my trust, but I'm also going through a similar experience with regards to my mental health. I'm trying to work my way through it, but was wondering what your advice is with regards to my colleagues, team and managers. Do I discuss it with them? And Adrian's answer was, yes, definitely discuss with a small group of trusted colleagues. Just don't feel under pressure to tell anyone, just those you work closely with and those you have built up a strong relationship with. I would definitely advise you to seek support going forward, as coping with depression can be bewildering and lonely. Another question for Adrian was, as someone who's considering advancing their leadership role, what is your advice about having a good work-home life balance? And Adrian has responded, to have a good work-home balance, you need to have limits on time and try and stick with them. Create definite obligations with friends and family. Cycle to work as a way of creating a definite cutoff. Keep dialogue going with family regarding this. Take all holidays due to you, but make sure you book well in advance to have a focus or something to look forward to, a goal to enjoy. I like that point. And a final question for Adrian was, as a person in a leadership role, how do you approach bullying at a level higher than yourself? Would you take the official route for bullying, or would you try to deal with this yourself initially? And I think this is a very brief answer to the point where he says, bullying, confront head on, make sure you have supportive colleagues around you. And then we have questions for Paul Rees. So Paul is our CEO of the college, and he's here with us today. So are you okay, Paul, for me to read out the questions and then you can respond? Is that all right?
Absolutely, yes.
Thank you. So this is from someone who didn't want to be named, and it was, I was really pleased to hear that well-being of psychiatrists remains a focus for the college. Can you tell me what additional services will be provided as we hopefully come out of COVID to support psychiatrists with their mental and physical health? Over to you, Paul.
Yes, thank you very much. Clearly, the well-being of our members of psychiatrists is an absolutely key issue for the college. And as you'll know, it's one of Adrian's priorities as president, workforce well-being. So we've just put together our budget for the next financial year. Our budgetary year aligns with the calendar year. So it's the 2022 budget, and we are taking on 2 additional members of staff, well-being coordinators, to help us deliver more well-being support to members. We're also taking on well-being champions, being appointed through each division and devolved nation, and they will connect the college with trusts and boards. And then also we're producing more work on COVID guidance. I think Ananta, obviously, as part of this event, she led on a really important groundbreaking work that we did as a college, giving COVID guidance, particularly around the challenges that Black, Asian and minority ethnic doctors have faced. And there's more work to come out on that. We also plan to issue guidance on tackling workplace bullying based on race early next year. And indeed, following the success of our first ever membership survey, we're going to be doing another survey later on this year, looking at the experiences of doctors who define themselves as LGBTQ+, looking at what employer organisations do to support them, and then really encouraging trusts and boards to take the issue of bullying against LGBTQ staff more seriously, and also vis-a-vis race, taking that more seriously as well. We saw the MRES data that came out recently, and we saw that clearly discrimination based on race is still a key problem within the NHS. So we want employers to take more action on all of these fronts.
Thank you, Paul. And I think the next question is also keeping in line with what you've just explained, but possibly a bit more specific. And this is around the college doing an amazing job on diversity, equality and inclusion. And what is the college doing to influence specifically trusts to follow suit?
So yes, we see equality, diversity, inclusion as an absolute priority, and again, it's one of Adrian's priorities as president. And actually, this work that we've been doing over the last few years aligns very much with our values. So for the last 3 years, we've been a values-based organisation, and our values, hopefully you all know them, are courage, innovation, respect, collaboration, learning, and excellence. And we remember those values by the acronym CIRCLE. Now, values can sound a bit trite, they can sound a bit like management speak, but actually a number of our very senior members realised early on that actually us taking a values-based approach would drive changes in the way that we tackled equality, diversity and inclusion. And the first person to contact me, apart from the officers, once we decided to take this approach, was Dame Fiona Caldecott, who sadly passed away earlier this year. And she was strongly of the view that taking a values-based approach is inherently linked to being strong on equality, diversity and inclusion. And since we took on the values-based approach 3 years ago, we've started to mark as major events on the college calendar Pride, South Asian History Month, which is our own bespoke event, which we started last year, Black History Month, and International Women's Day. In 2018, we published a statement on the effect of mental health of racism. And in 2020, we were the first college to publish a statement on our website condemning all forms of racism after the murder of George Floyd. And this went down really well with members. One member tweeted, this one statement has made 35 years worth of membership fees worth it. We've published a statement attacking the racist abuse heaped on the black footballers who missed penalties in the Euros final. And in 2019, we were named as Charity of the Year in the European Diversity Awards. Earlier this year, we published an Equality Action Plan, which has got 29 actions, and we're making good progress on those. And we do get feedback from women, Black, Asian, minority ethnic and LGBTQ plus members saying they feel that for the first time they're included by the college, which is really important to us, and other colleges are looking to us for advice and guidance on how to embed equality, diversity and inclusion. In terms of the trusts and boards and how do we influence them, that's actually a bit of a trickier issue. We can try to make sure we get our own house in order, but trying to make sure that employer organisations do the right thing is trickier. However, that's covered by our Equality Action Plan, which is on our website. It's got 29 actions, and around about a third of those actions are related to employer organisations and urging them to take tougher action to promote equality, diversity and inclusion. We've got a whole range of actions, such as the LGBTQ plus survey, such as our guidance on tackling workplace bullying, such as Adrian's become a board member of the NHS Race Observatory, Race and Health Observatory. So we've got a whole range of actions. It's difficult for us. We can't tell employer organisations what to do. We can encourage them. We also hold a regular engagement event with medical directors on an annual basis of trusts, and we try to sort of encourage and nudge them in the right direction. A lot of them are very supportive of the work we're doing, and we hope that together we can get to a much better place on equality, diversity and inclusion.
Thank you so much for that, Paul. And thank you for being here today as well. It's been really fantastic. Is that okay? We're going to move on to our next speaker in the interest of time, and that's Professor Nandini Chakraborty, who is our new recruitment lead for the college. And I have some questions already. Are you happy for me to go through them?
Sure.
Okay. So one of the questions was, does CESR make it more difficult for you to progress in your career compared to CCT? And probably the other bit of the question is, are consultants with a CESR not allowed to apply for fellowship of the college?
One of the major pieces of work I would say that I have dealt with as ex-associate dean for equivalence in the last 5 years are the myths that go around CESR. And one of the myths is that you are at a disadvantage at an interview panel if you are competing with a candidate with CCT, and your career is never going to look the same if you had a CCT versus a CESR. And what I would like to share with candidates is that I did a CESR when I was in my ST4 to ST5 years. I went on to go on to the specialist register 1.5 years earlier than I would have if I had continued in the CCT process. I'm not saying by any means that everybody should do it, but everybody has a right to choose what is the right pathway for them. And there is no concrete black and white, this is the right pathway. I did compete with a candidate with a CCT at my interview panel and got my first consultant job, my only consultant job at the moment at that point. I've gone on to hold several significant roles with the Royal College of Psychiatrists, which I am very proud of. I'm an honorary professor with the University of Leicester, but at the risk of sounding boastful, I would say that if anybody has a query about what a career with Cesr would look like, I would happily be an example of that. So if people have a query about, Cesr versus CCT and the quality of the consultant that comes out at the end of the road. I would say very much not just my story, but there are many stories out there with people with Cesr. The surprising thing is possibly people don't realize that when they meet quality or high-flying colleagues, how many of them actually have Cesr, and people should talk about it more. I do often get a look of surprise when I say that actually I have a Cesr and not a CCT, and I left my CCT route to pursue Cesr. So that's all from my end on that.
Thank you, Nandini. And that is very, very inspiring as well. And it's good to hear and I suppose kind of bring it on to the mainstream so we have more discussions around that. Another question for you is if a general adult psychiatry consultant would want to do a CESR in medical psychotherapy, can the college support this?
Absolutely. And I've had that query actually directly from a neighboring trust where there's not just one, but a couple of general adult consultants who are thinking about pursuing a psychotherapy Cesr. And the medical psychotherapists who are very much in demand and very pressured with the demands of the regular rotation are not in the great numbers required to support our trainees as we would like them to be supported. And so my answer to that is very much a yes. And I could share that I do have a meeting with that particular trust in the coming weeks to address a room full of colleagues to see how we could support them and guide them and demystify the process, which we've been trying to do for years. And just to add on to that, it's not just about somebody with a general adult CCT pursuing psychotherapy Cesr. We've had a number of queries in the last 2 years, I would say, about people with general adult CCT working in intellectual disabilities or forensic for years as consultants in those areas and wanting their expertise recognized with a Cesr in that specialty. We've had at least one successful candidate with a general adult CCT go through with a successful CAMS Cesr. So it's definitely something to keep in mind in this room with our new consultant colleagues or people, approaching their early careers as a consultant, that your development journey does not end with coming on the specialist register. And if you are interested in a further specialist qualification, but obviously it might be difficult to go back to the traditional training route again once you're on the specialist register, then a Cesr in another specialty is definitely worth considering.
It's fantastic. Thank you so much for that. This is for the delegates. If you have any questions for Paul or Professor Chakrabarti, please do put it on the chat because some of our speakers can't stay for long. And if there are questions that come up later, we'll pass that on to you if that's okay. We next have questions for Professor Bamra. Senior consultant and honorary reader at the University of Manchester. Are you ready, Professor, for your questions? Okay. One of them was, in the current climate with COVID restrictions, what can a trust do to support new consultants integrating into the trust and into their teams?
Right, so hi folks, thank you very much. I think it's a difficult time all around for medics. I think that there's an issue not just for consultants. I know my bit was about new consultants, but trainees and staff grade doctors are facing quite a stiff challenge at the moment. But when new consultants start at a trust, and many of them will work for the same trust where some of them will have trained, but others will go to a new trust. We're a very migratory medical society. By the way, new recruits could be people who move from one trust to the other as well, because in my days, of course, I've been in the same place for the last 40 years, trained here, and have been, I was going to say stuck here, but happily stuck here in Manchester. and so new consultants are also people who move to another trust these days. the challenges are quite big, aren't they? I think, I mean, in nowadays, you know, there used to be a whining and dining thing. Paul, maybe we should campaign for that, and the CEO of the college should join in as well. But I don't think we actually do a proper induction, you know, for new consultants. That's my little beef. Here you are, people right at the top of their game, people who should be welcomed with open arms after sometimes a grueling interview process. And I think we really should have the whole executive warming up to them, inviting them. This is what I did. I'm sure Anantha does and other medical directors do. But what I used to do is to invite them to meet with all my executive colleagues. That is the most important thing. They need to know everyone in their executive team, not just the chief executive and the medical director, but the nursing director, the director of finance. Many of us have no idea about finances, and you know, they could be your most important ally when you're a medical director. So I'd like the trust to at least tea and biscuits, if not wine and caviar, is to invite them, to meet with them, and that should be part of their induction. Too often the induction is very rushed. You know, you just go around in one day and you're meant to know the whole trust, particularly if you haven't worked there. It's a bit difficult. And sometimes you have international medical graduates who come here as consultants and they have no idea about the NHS, let alone, not enough anyway, let alone the trust. So what I would say is that I mean, I would happily do this, you know, but I think the college should have a template for, I still do the appointments committees for the college. They're not as rigorous, I have to say, as they used to be. In fact, for many years, for 15 years, I used to train consultants who consultants who were panelists on the AACs. I'm not quite sure whether the college does that, but there's so much we could do at the NHS level, but also the college level. There should be a template where people can feel really very welcomed into the trust. You know, we just kind of throw them feet into a very busy job, often a 14 PA job with 10 PAs really. So that's my first point, Sharda. I think that colleagues could be a bit more welcoming as well. I know things have got very busy. When I was a new consultant in those days, we used to work for a combined trust, so we had medics and surgeons all in one trust. We used to every year have a dinner. Just the consultants have a dinner where you get to meet all your colleagues. I'm not quite sure how many people do that. You know, we're psychiatrists, we should be looking after everybody's emotional well-being. I would love it that consultants, SAS doctors, junior doctors could be invited as well, but certainly for new consultants, every year meeting with their colleagues over an informal dinner would be absolutely wonderful, you know. So I was the chair of the medical staff committee as well for a very long time, 12 years in all. And you know, we don't have very many people, new people included, coming to the medical staff committee. You know, I'd like to bring back that culture of support and the camaraderie that you see. So there are things that consultants on the ground could do as well for newly appointed consultants, not just let them, you know, sink or swim. It's a really tough time, particularly around COVID. And what could we do around COVID? Well, we are kind of hopefully at the tail end of COVID. You don't know how long the tail is going to be, but you know, hopefully we're at the tail end. So things are getting back to normality. I did see some fantastic work at my trust, you know, where consultants were supported who had to isolate or who had to be in quarantine. I don't know that we've actually, I know my trust chief executive has sent around thanking people. My trust last week, in Monday actually, this week, chief executive sent an email around every member of frontline staff to say, you are going to get 1 day off. So everybody from this week has a day off just for helping out during COVID. I'd like to see other trusts also emulate that to say, look, you've had a really tough time and we're really grateful to you. A day a week, I know other colleagues would have to cover, but it's a great gesture personally, I think. So I think that would be just a couple of other things I wanted to say. Adrian brought up the issue of depression, and I mean, he's a phenomenal guy, isn't he? I think he's just an absolutely amazing president that we have, who talks about real life things. And I know he's not here, so I can't praise him. But one of the things that people don't do is actually talk about their own mental health things, stress and other things. I do as well. We only get to seniority when we talk about it, isn't it? It would be good if people talk about it right from the beginning. But I think it's important to get the official process going as well. Talk to HR. Some people don't even say they join as new consultants and they haven't mentioned that they've had a depression because of that fear, that they would be stigmatized by colleagues. And this is in psychiatry. So I'd like us to see, us provide better HR support for consultant colleagues as well, and other colleagues who have this. And one other thing I wanted to say about bullying and harassment, Paul is so absolutely right. And bullying and harassment, particularly when you're a younger consultant, is really, you're very vulnerable. It could be very subtle bullying, look, I'm going to be off the next couple of weeks at very short notice. And can you cover? The implication by a senior consultant being, you're going to cover for me, and giving relatively. So there are subtle ways. So I think that's important that that bullying and harassment is tackled. And I'm sorry, I don't want to trample on other people's territories, but they are all relevant to the new consultant bit as well. But in terms of Cesr, I wish there was no Cesr really, Nandini. I think everybody should get a CCT, to be truthful, because there is that people who get a Cesr do often feel that they are second-class citizens. And you will probably know this, that Ramesh Mehta, the president of BAPIO, and I, as chair of BAPIO, wrote to the GMC last year to say that Cesr CP, which is a combined program, should be abolished. And lo and behold, to our surprise, in June last year, Charlie Massey wrote to Ramesh and I to say that the CP combined program would be abolished. So I think that's where we should go. Combined program is where foreign graduates come here, join at ST2, ST3 level, and they ended up with an even more less looked favorably at Cesr, if you like, Nandini. So I'd like, that we are actually more in tune with CCTs. I know I've stepped beyond my territory, haven't I, Sharda? Now I can shut up.
Not at all. I was very impressed by the whole compassionate leadership, the examples that you have provided. And I think it's really important during this particular time when morale is low and it's very hard to kind of maintain that cohesion. So it's very good to hear from you, and I'm sure all our delegates would also be kind of thinking and processing what you've said. So please do feel free to add on your comments to the chat. One other.
Can I just say one other thing, Sharada? Sorry, one thing I forgot to mention, and the college has fantastic guidelines on this, which is mentorship. So I used to ask new consultants, who is your mentor? Directly ask them, because they get so busy, they kind of are all into appraisal and all that sort of thing, which they know about, revalidation. But mentorship is so crucial, particularly when you're just starting, and maybe every few years at the college, we should just remind people that we have this fantastic mentorship document that people need to know about. There are really very good guidelines, better than any other college, I believe.
Thank you. I'm afraid we do have to move on to our next speaker. Thank you so much for that, Professor. Hassanan, are you ready for your questions?
I'm always ready, Sharada. So yeah, thank you for inviting me. And thanks everyone for organizing and delivering today's StartWell event. I hope this is the last online StartWell, and maybe we can catch up next year face to face in the beautiful college.
That's the hope.
That's the hope. Yeah.
So Hassan, a question for you is, if we were to have personal ideas about services a division could be providing for supporting new consultants or SAS doctors to support them at the regional or division level, who would we approach and how do we go about it?
Yeah, thank you. It's a good question. So I think new consultant, SAS, even senior trainees I would encourage everyone to approach your regional, your chair, your vice chair in your region, if you are in the Southeast, if you're in London, if you're Northwest in any division, approach the chair, approach the vice chair, approach the PTC rep, maybe if you're a senior trainee and you want to get in touch with the college and the divisional activities. In every division, there are lots of roles you could be involved in terms of augmenting your leadership and management experience, your educational portfolio, your mentoring and coaching skills. So I would say approach your division, go to the chair of the division or the manager of the division, and they will signpost you in the right direction.
Okay. And the other bit is with experience, you know, how soon can someone get involved with the division or with the college?
Yeah, an interesting question. I will reflect on my personal experience. I think when I was a CT2 early in my career, I met Dr. Hugh Series, who was the chair of the division at the time, Southeast Division, and I said I want to be involved in the college. And I think the first role I had with the college was as a CT3 level, which was a member of the Iraq subcommittee. And then now thinking about it, I think I have like 6 or 7 links with the college, mentoring group, trainee support group, the Iraq subcommittee or the diaspora group, and the divisional vice chair for the Southeast and the philosophy and the cultural SIGs. So a number of hats, and I don't know how I can cope fitting them, but I think I can.
So are you suggesting straight away, or would it be helpful to have more experience before?
I would say just go straight away. You will learn. I mean, as a trainee, you will learn from more experienced people. You will learn from, I mean, when I was a member of the trainee support group or the IMG scoping group at the time, JS Pamela was one of the founders with Wendy Byrne. So hi, JS, and he's my mentor as well. And you get as soon as you can really CT2, CT3, CT1, even if you're interested, or even at a foundation level, if you're interested in a career in psychiatry. I mean, you don't need to have 20 years of experience to be, to have a specific role. I mean, some roles will require you to have at least like 3 years of experience as a consultant to be a CASC examiner or a regional advisor, but you can still get in touch with the division and get in touch with, because there are always roles for SAS doctors, for senior trainees, for new consultants. So I would definitely encourage the sooner you get into the college and the division, the better, I think, the more interesting you find your journey with the college.
Thank you so much, Hassan. I've got one more question. Sorry, this is for Professor Bamra. Sorry, putting you in the spotlight again. And this was...
Call me JS, by the way.
JS, sure. And this question was around what can I do or suggestions for using SPA time effectively, and a linked question around CEA awards. So basically, how do you think about using your SPA time so that it is productive in a career development kind of way, but also useful to the employers?
Yes, so this is really important, you know, because I think that people, Hassanan, it's great to see you. And thank you very much to you and Sharda and Karen for organizing this. So, you know, SPA time becomes swallowed up by direct, and people will know that the usual formula that, in fact, I was at the BMA when we negotiated the contract then, which was 7.5 direct clinical care PAs and 2.5 SPAs, which is your supportive professional activities. And you know, your SPA gets swallowed up into your direct clinical care time, but your SPA is as equally important because that is your personal development. The college has a fantastic CPD program. I can say that because I was the one who produced the template that you have now. And Paul, you can give me a bottle of champagne afterwards, and it still stands till today as director of CPD then. That's the program which, and so you must remember that your CPD is not just the 50 hours, it's a minimum of 50 hours. People often forget that. It's a minimum of 50 hours. And also if you do have your peer group is part of your SPA, your audit is part of your SPA. Anything you need to do to help your research career, your professional managerial career, or your professional clinical career, they're all part of your SPA. Your SPA is, I find that it might be all right for many people, but a lot of people then do SPA time in their own time. But it is all to be accounted for when you do your appraisal. You will be surprised by how much time you do in your own time. So yes, and linked with that is, of course, your excellence. I'm on the Clinical Excellence Awards Committee for the Northwest region, as some of you will be as well. It's very demanding because you are pressed against the surgeons and some of the gastroenterologists and others who have outcome data, which comes out through every CVQ. There is a lot of outcome data that we have in psychiatry, but in applications, people don't seem to show that excellence. Really, CEAs, people should be building up, regardless of how you feel about CEAs, it is really there for consultants. It is what has been negotiated by the government, by the BMA with the government for consultants. We should not feel shy about it. Try and plan that right from the beginning when you start as a consultant, and demonstrate what it is that you're doing to transform your services. And I think every trust should have something on CEAs, to be truthful, because it's very discouraging that for some people that either they're applying recurrently, usually the applications need to be very rigorous, the evidence isn't there, but you're also up against a lot of other people, including academics in medicine and surgery. So I would say there should be something about CEAs. Maybe the college should do that.
Thank you for that, JS. And I've just noted there was a question in the chat, and Professor Chakrabarty has gone ahead and answered that. And I hope that's helpful. We'll next move on to, we have questions for Chris Hopkins. Chris, are you around?
Hi, Sharada. I'm just here.
Hello, nice to see you, Chris. So I think there are a couple of questions for you. And let's start with the one on the chat. Hang on, let me scroll up. That is from Helen Lee. Hang on.
Three questions from Helen.
And which one, Sharada?
No, I'll come to that in a minute because my laptop is playing up a bit. So I'll just kind of come back to the question in a minute. But the first one for you, and this was sent in earlier, was with the power of hindsight, if you could have done one thing differently in the first 6 months since joining as a new consultant, what would that be?
That's a big question. I think I attended StartWell last year and I found it really helpful at the time. I think the bit on job planning was really useful. So I think going into the post, I tried to be realistic about planning my job, thinking about when I'd fit in direct clinical care, thinking about how I'd manage supervisions. I suppose I wanted to be accessible to the team and fit in with the team. And my team was under a little bit of pressure with referrals and kind of, I guess, kind of matching them to our capacity. And I think maybe I tried to be accommodating. Maybe I bent a little bit too far with accommodating things. At the time, I think that was necessary, but I think maybe I've kind of concretized a few things in my timetable that I hadn't anticipated doing earlier on. And I'm conscious that when you start in a new post, some of the things that maybe are one-offs at the start can become a habit and can become a bit more set. And I wish I'd really given a bit more thought to that at the time, because there's a few things now that I would like to change, but it feels that you're kind of pedaling back a bit more to try and engender the change. And the last thing I would want to do is lose that accessibility and rapport with the team. And so it's just a little bit of a tight spot in that regard. And I just wonder if earlier on when I set that template, I've been a bit clearer about expectations and where things fitted in. But I think it can be hard, really marrying, keeping a boundary, which you need to have to some extent, but also being accessible to the team and gelling with the team. So I think that's really, really important earlier on in the consultant post.
Thank you so much, Chris. I found the question for you. And this is a question for Chris Hopkins. Thank you, Chris. I found your talk really helpful. Could you tell us more about both your system for prioritizing emails, as I think this would really help me, and also your ideas about your improvement of supervision? Thanks.
I think as a registrar, I felt I got lots of emails. Helen, by the way, hi, because I know Helen from before. I think becoming a consultant, the number of emails really kind of increased quite significantly. I suppose you really get kind of a hodgepodge of emails. You get urgent clinical inquiries that come through, and I think come through more now with our virtual working. You get kind of relatively routine things that come through. You get copied into lots of things just for information, and that happens an awful lot. And some of those things, are entirely benign. You don't really need to do much with, and some things actually have a latent meaning to them, and you do need to action things. And then on top of that, you have all of the academic college emails and things like that. So there's a real mix of emails you get. What I've tended to do, because I hate having a huge email inbox where you've got hundreds of emails all mixed in, is have a few different folders, and as they come in, I move them to the folders and flag them as needed. And that way you can make sure you're not missing out on interesting academic pursuits and developmental things in the trust, within the college, because they're still there saved and they don't get lost in your morass of emails. But equally, you have a focused inbox. So at the end of the day, if it's 4:30 and you're trying to wrap things up, you can ensure safety and get back to people in a timely way with the clinical things. So I kind of just tend to kind of shift them out, and it's slightly satisfying as well. It feels, while it's a mirage, it feels like you're being more productive moving the emails on. I appreciate that I sound a little bit pedantic with this, but some of the small pleasures are good.
Thank you so much for that, Chris. And I realize I just kind of dived right in because obviously I know you, Chris, but the others don't. So Dr. Chris Hopkins is a brand new consultant psychiatrist, an old age psychiatrist, and I see that another one of our new psychiatrists has joined, Dr. Judy King. Hi, Judy, and welcome. I've got one more question for you, Chris, and I suppose they've been directed to you and Judy, but your take on it would be interesting. So do you have any tips for what to look out for when you're, say, scouring potential, consultant posts? Any red flags? What do you need to watch out for?
Do you want to start with that?
Yeah,
Judy?
I can take that one, Chris. Hi everyone. I've joined a bit late, so I might have missed some of the answers that Chris has given before. But I mean, it's been a while now since I applied for jobs, but I remember looking through all the job descriptions. And one of my sort of tips or things that I remember thinking at the time was obviously as sort of higher trainees, we're used to changing jobs frequently. And my sort of priority for me anyway is about the team that I'm working for, and I wanted to make sure that I work somewhere where there's other people that work well together, if possible. It helped that I became a consultant in the trust, that I was a higher trainee, so there's a lot of sort of insider info that I already had. But I remember looking at other trusts' sort of job descriptions, and they often do sort of tell you what consultants are working where. And I was a bit put off by the ones that I saw where there's lots of unfilled posts, which I think is going to happen in places, and that's fine. But that was something that put me off. And I think I was just sort of really keen to work somewhere where I knew that there was sort of a great team that I'd be working with. So working with a lot of great consultant colleagues, but also the team itself. So I did go into a post which had a history of lots of locum consultants, and I think that's quite common. But I knew that actually, as a whole, the rest of the sort of CAMS consultant team that I work with was quite, had a good staffing, and really supportive and friendly bunch. As I say, so you can kind of get a lot from reading the actual job descriptions. If it's some, I mean, obviously I worked in the place, so there's tons of extra information I had. But if you can kind of go and call or visit, I think just sort of knowing what the ethos and values of the trust are, I had the opportunity to be able to sort of go to some of the senior leadership meetings and things, and I think you just get a sense of it being a place that you want to work and what people are like. In terms of the actual team itself that I was going into, I knew that there were some unfilled posts, but generally the people that were there had stayed there for a long time. It was sort of reflective of it being probably quite a nice place to work. The sort of job plan and on-call duties and things suited me. So that's sort of important to look at. I don't know if there's anything that any other tips, Chris?
I suppose for people who are a little bit of a way away from CCT, I'd really encourage going and having a look at the NHS Jobs website early on, and you know, regularly having a look to see what's there. I was quite struck myself by the number of jobs that are advertised serially and are unfilled for a very, very long time. A lot of which have very attractive adverts and very nice job plans or golden handshakes and things. But I think it's quite interesting with those jobs, and I'm going to sound really cynical, but some of them I think maybe aren't filled for a reason. I think when you dig down with some of them and explore them, you find there are other issues that are there. As I think it's really important to try and get information from within the trust, ideally within the team. And I think if there is something you're interested in, then asking to meet with the service manager and to go along and actually physically see the place, I think is something that's entirely reasonable and is really, really helpful. And I certainly found that going to see the porter cabins that I work in, while not glamorous on the outside, were kind of on the inside very well set up. And that was really reassuring before I went for my interviews. And I knew I had a sense that I was going into a situation I was comfortable with. I think one thing I would be also a bit wary of is looking at the mock job plans you get in the adverts. I find a lot of times the job plan that's put in the job advert doesn't necessarily marry up entirely with the reality of the post. And so I think getting this other information is key, because what you don't want to be doing is applying for a job that's kind of more, I guess, on paper than a reality, if that makes sense.
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you so much, Judy and Chris. And Judy, there was one more question, which was kind of, we did ask Chris before you joined, and this was with the power of hindsight, you know, if you could have done one thing differently in the first 6 months after joining, what would that be?
So I think I caught the tail end of Chris maybe talking a bit about the sort of wanting to, you know, although I worked in the trust, I hadn't worked in the team that I work in, and I think you do want to be supportive and helpful and you know, not be a good team player. But what I found very different is that sort of you know, can you do this? Can you see this? Obviously, the demand is so high. You quite quickly can get overwhelmed with new people that people are asking you to see. And I think as a trainee, well, I had my sort of supervisor saying, no, this is the number of people, this is no more, send them here, send them there. Whereas that's my job now. I say kind of, it's easier when other people are saying no, if you like. And I think you do have to be quite boundaried about, it's not always helpful for you to be the first person to get involved in that particular situation, and it's just sort of learning to do that. So I think you were already talking about that, Chris, but that's quite a difficult thing to negotiate sometimes. So yeah, sort of that side of things. And then I think just as time's gone on, it's just sort of being a bit more thinking about the future a bit more. So you can get quite overwhelmed with all the day-to-day clinical stuff, and it's important to take some time out to reflect on what you want, what your sort of goal, you know, obviously you have to do your goals and things, but actually think, what do I want to be doing? What do I want to be doing in the future, and how will I get there, and what do I need to do to make it happen? So it's sort of just not getting too bogged down by the day-to-day stuff and thinking ahead as well.
Yeah, that's fantastic. Thank you, Judy. I see a comment here, and this is Nandini, who has said it's an interesting discussion around unfilled jobs. It might sometimes become a vicious cycle for a post. Another way of looking at it is if it has an advantage in terms of geographical location or something around personal work-life balance. This might be a good opportunity to negotiate and get the best deal for you. So that's a brilliant tip. This, I'm not sure who this question is for. This is from Uma, so I'm just going to put it out there, and then speakers can decide who would want to comment. How can one position or transform themselves overnight as a senior colleague in the team after taking up a locum consultant job and transform mentally from an SAS doctor when one was doing jobs as they were told to do, and then delegate jobs to colleagues? That is being on the other side. I think I get you, Uma, but how do you transition? It's like being from a trainee to a consultant post. So who wants to have a stab at it? We've got so much experience in this meeting. Nandini's just said being assertive.
Yeah, go for it, Nandini. You go for it, and then I'll come in.
Okay. I think this is the advantage of when you are a local trainee, you know the systems, you know the area, but it also comes with the slight disadvantage of you work with people who have seen you as a trainee and you never kind of grow up. And the only way of doing it is, once you're a consultant, you mark your place and say, I am a consultant. I think I started off with having maybe some senior consultants kind of behave as if I was still a trainee. And especially because I was seen as a premature consultant. They weren't expecting me to be a consultant for another 1.5, 2 years. But you put your foot down and say, this is it. And, I'm not going to be delegated jobs like you would be delegating them to other junior colleagues. You take your decisions and be confident in yourself. That's all.
I think, I think it's a very important question. It's like the other thing that you were saying, Sharda, which is Chris and Judy very eloquently talked about, which is your transition from being an SPR to being a consultant. Nobody ever taught you to become a consultant. You learn a lot about your experts at diagnostics and investigations, and your clinical stuff is absolutely A-class. Nobody learns about the politics of being a consultant and the other stuff, huge responsibility that you have to carry. And I think the transition from SAS to consultant is even more difficult because, obviously you have worked in that capacity as an SAS often for some time before you become a consultant, and people have this idea. I think if I were an SAS doctor, I would move trusts, because people have this loaded idea about what you might be in that position. But if you're in the same position and in the same team, perhaps you have established trust within the team. I think you've got to be bold. You're a consultant, as I think Nandini said, or somebody said. You're a consultant. But again, I would go back to what I was saying earlier, which is the college has a fantastic mentorship scheme. Make sure you have a mentor. Something that Chris said, which I missed out in my talk, and I'm ever so sorry that I did, but he's reminded us, get your job planning done within the first 6 months, which is really generally a requirement, but people don't generally know that, because you can sit down with your line manager one-to-one and work out your aspirations. The team will always tell you what their aspirations are, but what are your aspirations? It's a 50-50 thing. I don't know whether that answers the question, Chadha. I think Ananta has a hand up as well.
That's right, yes. I mean, that's helpful, JS. Ananta?
Yeah, I'll just come in very briefly. I know there are other questions as well. I think it's an incredibly important question and, not always easily navigated. But I think firstly, the quality of clinical work you do garners huge respect. So always make sure that that's very good, whatever grade you're working in, and that helps to, develop that respect. But I think also the other bit is, I think putting yourself forward, showing initiative in terms of whether it's quality improvement projects or anything else that requires doing in the team. So putting yourself forward and saying that this is something you would like to do helps you to develop those leadership skills of, marking your ground as a consultant, if you like. I suppose the third thing is that there is an onus on the team leader, manager, whoever it is, to ensure that everyone, whether it is an SAS doctor becoming a consultant, whether it is a newly minted consultant against an established consultant, trainee becoming a consultant, these are all tricky things to navigate. And I think there's an onus on the leader or the manager of the team to ensure that there is space provided for these open discussions, having touching base with some of the non-clinical issues that crop up in the team and how we can gel together as a team with everyone being valued for their unique roles and responsibilities. So there is that importance of team building and valuing everyone equally that needs to be built in as well. Thanks.
Thank you so much, Ananta. Does anyone have any points to make before we move on to our next speaker? No, and if something else comes up, I'll keep an eye on the chat. Thanks again. So we next have Dr. James Jeffs. James, are you in the meeting?
Yep, I'm here.
Thank you. So James did the talk on us on medical appraisal and revalidation, and there are a couple of questions which have been sent in. Are you happy to take them now?
Yeah, that's fine.
Yep. So one of them is around the, are there any changes, particularly around the revalidation or appraisal due to the COVID situation? That's the first one.
Okay, so it's a kind of a yes and no for that. So there were some changes, but I'm not sure how relevant they will be now. I mean, the changes were to delay revalidation for a certain cohort who were due to revalidate between March 2020 and March 2021 by a year. So that's now, the GMC started sending out notices of revalidation again from this April. So that's a change that happened that's sort of gone. And the Academy of Medical Royal Colleges put out some new appraisal sort of information and guidance to basically help focus appraisals on what the minimum requirements were, so as not to overload people. But in practice, my experience is people have been keen to revalidate, keen to have their appraisals still, and certainly the appraisals that I've done have had just as much information submitted this time as they ever did, really. So I don't think there's a major change. It's probably, obviously specialty dependent, but I think, it hasn't made a huge impact on us, I don't think.
No, thank you. The next question for you is, what are the meetings that count towards professional CPD points? For your CPD submission, is it team management meetings? Do we include them in our submissions?
Okay, so I think what you need to think about is the concept. What do we mean by CPD? So it's professional development. So did your management meeting develop you professionally? I suspect probably not, if it's anything like the ones that I've attended. So what the GMC says is that you need to focus on the outcomes of what you do, not the inputs. So it's not the time you spent, it's what you got out of it, and that you've got to reflect on it. So as usual, any activities will be approved by your PDP group and discussed with your appraiser once you've done them. And so you've got to make a good case that it did develop you in some professional way and you could reflect on it. You might get away with a single meeting that completely changed your perspective and you went away and read something and you've done a reflective note. But otherwise, I include in the professional section PDP group meetings, but within reason. I think I wouldn't, you can't make up a significant proportion of your hours with them, but you could put a couple of hours or so of them in your, but it's up to your PDP group, but you don't want a group that goes too rogue.
Can I just come in there, Sharda? Sorry, I've got something to say about everything, haven't I? Sorry about that.
That's brilliant. That's why we have you here, JS.
So when I drew up the college council document on CPD, what I wanted to do was to make sure that psychiatrists work in pairs. At the time, there was a trend amongst psychiatrists to say that peer groups should not, it's too much of a hassle. But what I did allow was exactly what James was saying, is up to 5 of your 50 hours, 10% of them, could be regarded as things that you do that are not exactly attending lectures or doing workshops or things like that. And that precisely would be it. But as James said, most of your management meetings are nothing you will learn from. But if there is a particular focus on, say, payment by results or commissioning or something like that, you might learn something new. But 5 CPD points, which includes your peer group meetings, isn't very many. So you have to be choosy that you do a reflective note on what actually how you've benefited from that.
Thank you. Another question for you, James, and this is, can the appraisal process be used to improve my working conditions? And if so, how do I go about it?
Not very effectively, is what I would say. It's probably not the correct tool. I do know people that like to log issues in their appraisal document, because it is a formal document that is recorded. But I don't think you can necessarily assume that every word in your appraisal is going to be read by anyone apart from your appraiser. I think that the right tool might be the job planning meeting, and that can feed into your appraisal. But the best time to change your working conditions is when you accept a post, because that's the moment that certainly currently that's the moment you have the most power. After that, you lose some power. But I guess you've also got to be thinking, if there's a working conditions problem in your post, it's probably affecting other people. Now you're a consultant. What are you going to do about it? Because, you know, I think that's one of the things that does mark a consultant, going back to your earlier conversation, that marks a consultant from an SAS, is that with a consultant, you expect people to come forward with a solution, not just coming forward with an issue. So that would be my advice. Think it through, work out how it's affecting anyone else, try and generate a solution, and then try and sell that solution to the people you need to sell it to. But I wouldn't think that the appraisal is going to be a very effective way of making changes. You can register how poor working conditions might be impacting on your ability to meet your PDP goals or validation aims or whatever, you know, but beyond that, it's probably not going to be very effective.
Yeah. Right. Thank you. If the delegates have any other questions around appraisal and revalidation, please do ask or put them in the chat. And I wonder whether you're ready, Anantha Dave, for questions. I think you have quite a couple. Thank you for your patience. I'll start off with the ones that were sent out already, and I think this is from Dr. Paul Gallagher. And he's asked, I've started working in a liaison team that has recently had to adapt to a geographical split between the older adult and working age adult teams. In addition to 2 new consultant appointments, myself and a significantly more senior consultant to the older adult team. What advice would you give to maintain team cohesion and maintain the positive working relationships already existing?
Wow, good question. And I think we are increasingly seeing these changes happening as services adapt either to increase in demand or COVID regulations or, you know, changes to service models. I think firstly, it's important to acknowledge that this is a big change. It's very tempting to just get on with the task of doing it, you know, so just everyone goes their own way, they get geographically separated and they try and continue to do the work. But it's actually quite a significant change for the team, and for whether it is new people coming into the team or, you know, people who've been with the team for a while. It's quite a big shift. So I think, you know, acknowledging the extent of the change and being able to create an atmosphere where people are able to input openly. So there does need to be the setting out of some kind of team dynamics or openness and transparency, and that safe space within teams where people are able to talk about how it affects them and how they feel, either as a whole group or, you know, within small groups or with their line managers, mentors. So being able to acknowledge the extent of the change, how it impacts them, and what it is that they are worried about, or what. So a combination of the challenges and the opportunities. While change can at first glance feel very hard and difficult to navigate and perhaps negative because it takes us out of our comfort zone and established habits and makes us confront something new. So in the beginning, it can feel very daunting, but every challenge, I think, comes with its set of opportunities and a chance to do something different. So being able to talk about both the opportunities and the challenges it presents, and what is it that, you know, can improve going forward? What are the chances? What are the new things that can be done? And what are the ways in which the team can still maintain cohesion? I mean, JS gave some very good examples of how we can, you know, when suppose for when a new person is entering a team in these times when there are restrictions, how can we still make them feel a part of the team? So For the new consultant, the established consultant, and for those who've been separated geographically, how are we creating opportunities for team building and cohesion? How are we ensuring that there are times when they all meet up as a bigger group? How are we ensuring that there is those relationships and the trust and the bonds and that sense of common purpose that was formed are still maintained? So I think really important to give time to this rather than just thinking of it as yet another change which has got to be got on with rather than navigated sensitively. So that bit I would say is important. And again, I think for a team, it is vital that there are several different perspectives which go into team functioning. If everyone was at the same level of seniority, had the same experiences, had the same attitudes, ideas, it would be very difficult to move things along or to effect change. So it's to be welcomed that there is a new consultant, an established consultant, some new teams forming, sub-teams forming, regrouping. This is an opportunity to inject fresh blood as well into the thinking of the team. So although the team has been well established before, the fact that it's now in two geographically different places gives opportunity for new ideas to emerge. So every fresh person entering the team is seen as somebody adding a new perspective, some diversity of thinking and ideas into the team. So valuing that as a positive rather than seeing that as a stumbling block, I think very important. And ultimately, all of us, everyone in the team being focused on that common purpose or outcomes. What are we trying to achieve here? We want the best services possible for older adults, for working adults. That is our aim. How do we achieve that given these new configurations? What outcomes are we trying to achieve? So sometimes focusing on the bigger picture and the outcomes rather than focusing on the personalities is really useful as a way of getting everyone to work towards common good. Thanks.
Thank you for that. And it's interesting because you mentioned this bit about, the cohesion not at the cost of individuality. And I think that kind of neatly brings us to the next question. This is in the chat. And this is from Walter Zika. I hope I'm pronouncing his surname properly, from Signet Healthcare. And they've asked, oh, hello there. And they've asked, thanks for your presentation on managing team conflict, in which you highlighted the importance of creating cohesion. It can be argued that groupthink may help clinical teams work more cohesively. When joining a team as a new consultant, how best do you avoid adopting any less helpful attitudes or aspects of their culture without being seen as disruptive?
Bold question and good question. I think, it's important not to be value-laden in answers, but groupthink suggests, I don't know. I think you've got to be aware that groupthink can mean that those who shout loudest and come across as more confident might actually be ending up setting the group tone or the thinking of the group. So really need to be mindful about what are we doing to get the best out of everybody in the team? New people, established people, people who belong to a particular culture, who are not of the culture, international graduates, doctors, nursing staff, allied mental health professionals, volunteers, admin staff. So firstly, recognizing, I think it's a change of attitude that's required. So recognizing that everyone has their place. If a team has to be vibrant and forward-looking and deal with changes that come upon it and with fresh challenges, I think you've got to value the input that everyone brings to the team. So starting off with an attitude that every new person brings value and strength is a good thing. And I think you are able to, I'm not quite sure about the less helpful parts of, whatever it is that people are bringing, but certainly I would say that if anybody, whoever it is, whether it's an established person, a new person, if you are trying to challenge somebody or have a difficult or sensitive conversation, or even a challenging conversation about something which isn't going well, which isn't suiting the purpose of the team, which isn't helping the work of the team, it's really important to establish that trusting relationship first. So ensuring a sense of being valued, of belonging, of being important, and of being considered important enough for people to give you time and listen to you is really important. So if you want to give somebody feedback about something challenging, you have to establish that relationship first. challenging anything unhelpful from anyone doesn't happen in a vacuum, nor can it happen as the very first thing that you come across, unless it is something which is so obviously unacceptable or criminal or something which, needs to be tackled differently. But in terms of what you think is unhelpful and you want to challenge somebody about it, establish that relationship with them first, give them the respect, make them feel valued and belong in a team, make them feel that what they say is important and their strengths will be recognized and acknowledged. And then you can start having a conversation about whatever it is that doesn't feel right. Also, I think, so using strengths to enable people to overcome their challenges is a really important thing, because it's very, very tempting to jump straight onto the negatives and try and sort of, sort people out. But the other thing also is I keep going back to this, and I found this incredibly helpful in my career over the years, is that sometimes it's important to step back from the personal and focus on what it is you're trying to achieve. So rather than making it as something personal, what is it that you find unhelpful, which is preventing the team objectives or, the clinical outcomes or whatever it is from being achieved. So focusing on what it is that you're trying to achieve rather than trying to sort out a person's qualities is more helpful, less intrusive and less threatening, if you like, and likely to get the person on board, because you're then asking everyone to buy into this common picture. So once again, it goes back to taking the time to create that team building, giving enough time to, respecting everyone and including everyone, but also creating a space where people are able to talk openly about what matters and being very clear about your team purpose. What are you here for as a team? And that everyone has a role to play in it, regardless of how junior or senior or wherever in the world they come from or whatever background or orientation they have. Thanks.
Thank you. That was kind of a very well-rounded explanation, and I think it added all the factors around influence, because that's what I was thinking of. And to change a team culture, it's usually people who have influence within the team rather than going straight and kind of attacking someone. So thanks for that. And I think the final question that I have for you is what do you do, or how do you react when two people in a team come to you with a conflict separately? So you end up being in the middle, and how do you work with that, and what would you do?
Yeah, again, a good question. I mean, I just want to say, go back to my previous answer and say the role of the team leader here is crucial. And ultimately, the way teams are the unit in which we all function in the NHS. And, ultimately teams are the way in which we all, club together and we deliver things together. So whoever is leading the team, whether they're called team leader, team manager, clinical lead, service manager, whatever it is their designation is, supporting them, getting the right people into those roles with the right values, giving them enough leadership and mentoring and supervision experience or time, and helping them to do their job appropriately is one of the most important things you can do. So I just wanted to add that, and it will also help in dealing with one-to-one conflicts. So I would firstly look at how, I think if you want to de-escalate a situation, ensure that you're starting with the top. So rather than the most senior person, I mean, here I'm talking as medical director, but I suppose it could be, that you're asking me this question as a team leader or manager. But I would try and start with the person who is the immediate line manager or the ones whom they would go to normally, rather than escalating it to the most senior person. That can feel extremely, that can make the persons involved in that conflict very vulnerable, that, those layers are being bypassed and people are going straight to the most senior person. It's tempting sometimes, and I sometimes get copied into emails between people, which I think is very unhelpful, and I really do not need to. I have trust, I have confidence in people being able to sort things out, and I'll step in when required. So firstly, introducing the least threatening and the least intrusive and the least escalating method of solving conflicts, seeing whether it is at all possible for the two of them to come together. Now, depending on how the structures work within each teams, either there will be somebody like a team leader, manager, who is able to bring two people together and see if it is possible for them to have face-to-face or a virtual face-to-face conversation. If not, if each of them have to be engaged separately, it's really important to maintain the trust and confidentiality of each person so that they feel able to share something which is sensitive, and again, relentlessly bringing it back to the issue in question rather than to personalities. I think, it sounds seemingly simple, but I think we forget this at our peril. And to try and see what is it that we are trying to solve or achieve, rather than trying to comment on how someone is as a person and what is, whether they are good or bad. That I think we need to get away from that temptation. So try and focus on the issue. Try and identify something common. It has happened for me on various occasions that when people have disagreed, we've started off with whatever it is in common between them. I mean, even if it is to say you both are members of this team, and I think you won't both want this team to do well. You both want patient outcomes to be good. Now that's a good, thread to start on, which is common. So whatever is happening is not helping that. So what can we do? So I think having those, so depersonalizing the situation and making it more about the issue, invoking common values, giving each of them safe spaces, the time required, making sure that you're dealing with layers of escalation in an appropriate way, and revisiting it. I mean, some of them have no easy answers. It's not as if you can say that everything is just sorted by conversations, and you need to revisit. Now, depending on how big the issue is, there are some, in various organizations, you have things like organizational development teams, leadership teams, mentoring within the organization. So, using OD, organizational development, as a way of looking at common themes which emerge. So this conflict, which is being personified by two people, might actually be something which is about something happening in the team, which is wider than these two people. So trying to identify issues at a systemic level rather than personalizing it is helpful. So these are some of the things that I try out, and sometimes being very honest and saying that I'm not able to come up with a solution straight away, but that doesn't mean it's not important. Can we agree that we'll try this for the next whatever few weeks or months and then come back to it? So being honest and open and not pretending to be a super person who can solve everything is also important, I think.
Thank you, because you hold so many hats and so many roles, and with your experience, I think it's really good to hear your views on managing it. And for the delegates, if you have any questions or any more questions, please could you put them on the chat or just raise your hand, and then we'll get to you. And if that's okay, we'll go to our next speaker. We have questions for. Thank you again, Anantha. It's Dr. Justin Wilson. Do we have Justin here?
Yeah, I'm here. Hello.
Hello, Justin. So Justin Wilson again. Used to be a medical director, now you're a chief medical officer at Surrey, and thank you so much for your talk. And we have a couple of questions for you which were sent beforehand, and if there are any more questions for Justin, please do put them on the chat. I'll have an eye out for it. So one of the questions is, I want to do more within my more roles within my division, but I'm facing reluctance from my trust to include this in my job plan. Would appreciate any advice on how to tackle this.
Okay, thank you. Yeah, medical director and chief medical officer, same thing really, as far as I'm concerned. So yeah, I've worked as medical director in Berkshire. It was good to see James Jeffs, actually. That was nice. I haven't seen him in a few years. I look like I thought he would now, and he hasn't changed. Anyway, hi James. I'm in danger slightly of having a different emphasis to an answer on this, because I'm just very mindful as a medical director that you really want the doctors to be positive and happy, and and happy with their plans and their work. And occasionally I have had situations over the years where there's been something that's emerged around their role that they've tried to deal with locally within the team, and maybe even to the associate medical director, and they're basically leaving the trust before I know anything about it. And I think one thing I would say, that all the medical directors that I know would be very keen to address issues, if they're not being satisfactorily addressed, that are causing unhappiness for their doctors and their consultants, particularly if they get to the stage where the person's thinking about either not taking up a role or leaving the role. So I think there is a tension in this. I mean, there's real demands on mental health services, even more post-COVID. And so there may be quite a lot of pressure from operations to think, well, we need to get this work done, and we need to make sure everybody's seeing as many patients as possible and getting the clinical work done. But it's important that everybody's job plan is balanced and achievable, and in terms of getting the balance so you can bring the most to the people that you do see, so you can get the documentation done well, and so that you're developing, particularly as a new consultant. And it's also really important that you have that local clinical leadership in the divisions to develop that strategy locally, linking in with the overall trust strategy and indeed the integrated care system approach to mental health and the national priorities. So I think it's really important that consultants step up to those roles, and I think if you have a consultant very keen to take a sort of divisional role to help bring that clinical leadership, then I would certainly want to support that, and I think most of my medical director colleagues would as well. So I would escalate it in the way described, but ultimately, if you need to involve more senior doctors in getting that right, then do, because I think we'd all welcome. Maybe part of your SPA time needs to be organised within the job plan, but it's important to identify roles that you're taking within the SPA time. But basically, I would encourage you to pursue it and escalate if necessary.
Thank you for that, Justin. I just noted Ananta's comment. I was happy to come back on that. Justin agreed that MDs need to intervene when required, a balance needed between everyone thinking they have to come to the medical director for problems and knowing which are the problems we need to step in to sort. So local leadership development is key.
Yeah, absolutely.
Mm-hmm. And another question was around, can you describe the approach to negotiating a job plan and joining a trust, and how pressures on organization can impact on this? And I think that is similar to the last question, because there's this perceived split, isn't there, or kind of, the demands of, say, different roles in the college or division, and is it opposed to what the trust or the organization wants, whether it's clinical pressures, waiting list, and how can a new consultant negotiate a job plan that doesn't seem or is not perceived as unfair and more skewed towards one side than the other?
Yeah, it does overlap with the previous question. Yeah, I agree. And it is this overall challenge that we have in terms of the need in relation to mental health, and the workforce challenge in terms of the limited pool of people with that expertise within mental health, including doctors. And so on one level, you're in quite a strong sort of negotiating position to get the job plan right, because we're not in a situation where, if you're applying for a role, there's 20, 30 other people applying for it as well. On the whole, we're struggling to recruit. In our trust, we're okay in most of the divisions, most of the specialties, but we're pretty much having one or two applicants for them. And in some areas, such as CAMS, I think everybody's really struggling to recruit the people they need for the team. So we're very reliant on, potentially in areas like that, you're reliant on agency, which is not a very cost-effective use of resources. So it's really important that we get that balance right, so that we have consultants that have the balanced job plan. They have a good balance of development, of contribution more widely, of clinical delivery. The time in their general life is sustainable, and you are in a good position at the outset to try and negotiate, so that's reasonable. Obviously, it's give and take, and we all want to make a good contribution to the organisation we're working within, but the job plan has to be reasonable, and actually, if you get it right, you'll be more productive and have a greater impact.
Thank you for that, Justin. Again, I'm looking at the chat. There's nothing more at the moment, but if there are any questions for Dr. Justin Wilson, please could you add it on there or raise your hand in the chat and I'll come back to you. Thank you for that. We'll move on to the next speakers, if that's okay, and that would be Dr. Alison Conway and Dr. Simon Michelson. You've done this brilliant talk about the consultant interview, preparing and performing well, and we do have a couple of questions for you. And the first one, are you ready for it?
We're
Yep.
ready.
We're ready. Yeah. So, advice regarding nerves. For some reason, I have major nerves in an interview situation and nothing has worked in the past. And how do I overcome this?
Yeah. Yeah, I'm going to take that one. I think, first of all, in my experience, it's really very common, and a lot of people aren't very open about the fact that they do get very anxious. And it's very understandable. We're all going to get anxiety to some degree, and some of it's motivating. But in my experience, I found that it's often the most conscientious doctors that actually worry the most. The ones that should be worrying the least are the ones that worry the most. And I think there's sort of three elements to it. One is, like we'll talk about later, is preparation. The more you prepare, the more confident you're going to be. And sometimes if people are anxious, I've noticed of these sort of, in CBT terms, sort of the sort of safety behavior that somehow, if they don't work at it, then, then if they fail, it doesn't matter quite so much. And also the anxiety can stop people preparing by thinking, well, I'm going to fail anyway, what's the point? So it's really important to get over that hurdle and prepare. I think the second element, which is crucial, is mock interviews. And again, people who are anxious are often the ones that actually avoid the mock interviews. And it's like a sort of phobia. I mean, it's a desensitization. The more you do, and I think that's where the CBT can start to come in a bit, where if you start to, at the end of the interview, note down these negative thoughts that you're getting. And the common ones that I came across, both in medics and non-medics actually, is things like, I look really anxious. I'm going red as a beetroot. I'm shaking. I'm taking too long to answer. And this is where, if you ask the people who are observing, most likely you're probably catastrophizing. And most likely you will say, well, you look a bit nervous, but no, that's not going to make a difference. And if you imagine yourself on a panel, and you're interviewing, you would expect people to be a bit nervous, and you wouldn't, put them down for that. So, there's all the practice, the mock practice, and then doing a bit of CBT on yourself. And most people will be familiar a bit, I guess, with the basics of CBT. And like I talked about in the talk itself, I think these thoughts come from beliefs that medics have. Well, I think from our training, we have these beliefs. We should never make a mistake. We should know everything. And I think we need to sort of question those, because those underpin some of these thoughts. And so the ones I mentioned in the talk were things like, if people remember their CBT, selective abstraction. So you got 1% slightly wrong. You did 70 instead of 60. And in your head in the interview, oh my God, I've screwed that up. And then you generalize, oh my God, I've screwed that question. I'm going to screw the whole interview up. And of course, that actually affects your performance. And as Alison will well know, doing a lot of interviews, is they'll try and mind read the interviewer, and try to see whether how they're doing. But I mean, the interviewer isn't a cheerleader. They're not going to do a sort of nice thumbs up when you've done a good question. They're there to be neutral. So and things like the shoulds that I mentioned before. I mustn't look anxious. I mustn't hesitate. And I suppose it's as these. First of all, preparing for these thoughts. Do you think about what your own profile is beforehand and start doing a evidence for and against? And for thoughts that, I'm rubbish at interviews, the chances are, I'm sure there's lots of evidence against it. You haven't got to where you are today without having passed them interviews. So preparing for these thoughts, and then during the interview, doing a sort of an OCD stop type procedure where you just don't indulge these thoughts. You don't let them take over. And because if you start indulging them, you're just on a slippery slope to affecting your performance. And, how many times have we been in an exam or the CASC or whatever, convinced you failed and you've actually done okay? So we are not a good judge of ourselves. So basically, lots of mock practice and just identifying these thoughts and doing a bit of CBT on them. And if you can't do it with yourself, maybe do it with a colleague, have someone help you. So I think there's a lot of things that, and I've, seen in sort of a lot of trainees who are anxious. If you do this work on yourself and you do the mock interviews, you can become a bit less anxious. I don't know if Alison wants to add a bit to that from the interviewer's point of view.
I think just to say that sitting on the other side of the table, you know, you realise some people do come across as very anxious, and I think panels will take that into account to some extent. I mean, obviously, if you're overcome by nerves and you can't answer any questions, then there's only a certain amount of allowance you can make. But, you know, you would expect people to be anxious. It shows that they're kind of taking it seriously. So I don't think you should worry that you have to appear completely confident and, you know, at your 100%, 110% best, because we know that these situations are stressful and it's an important event. So, you know, you should be stressed by it to some extent.
Thank you. We have the next question, which is quite pertinent during this time. What are the differences in preparing and attending a remote interview as compared to an in-person interview?
I mean, we covered this a little bit in the presentation, but I think some of the things Simon's just said really, but adapting them to this different setting. So practice, you know, I mean, in a way, it's almost easier to practice on a screen. You can get somebody to ask you questions. They don't even have to be with you. And you can record yourself, and that's really painful. But, you know, I think if you do think that you're not particularly good at interviews and answering questions, you can do that. So I think, you know, preparation, but also, you know, making sure that you're in the mindset that this is an interview. You have to take it as serious as you would if you were turning up and sitting in a room with the interviewers. So do, you know, dress up, sit in the right place. I mean, I've been in a few panels where people have been kind of sitting on sofas, or we had one where somebody was interviewed in a car, and that's not great. I mean, that doesn't sort of reek of you taking it seriously. You know, you shouldn't be at work. You wouldn't be at work on a day when you were doing an interview normally. So, you know, go to the best place possible, prepare yourself. I mean, I think it is difficult because it's hard enough when you're in a room and there's 6 or 7 people asking you questions and you don't quite know, you know, you're trying to make eye contact with everybody. On a screen, it's even harder to know where to look. And I think probably you just have to concentrate on the person who's asked you the questions. But, you know, I think it's just around preparation and practice, really.
I'm just going to sort of add that one thing I noticed with all the Zoom stuff is, and Alison pointed out, is how much gestures I sometimes make. And I think it's really important, as Alison said, to maybe have a video yourself doing an interview just to see about your sort of non-verbals, whether you have any tics or habits that might come across slightly annoying. The other thing is the research shows that, you know, there's a lot of communication comes out through our gestures, and we're missing those to a degree. So Alison may want to comment on this, but I guess the advice is, if you are doing sort of any sort of Zoom interview with patients, whatever, you might have to be slightly exaggerate some things like eye contact and maybe smiling. The other thing is that I guess with a Zoom interview, you don't always see everybody. So in a normal interview, you're meant to look at everybody. It's very difficult, I think, to do that if you're doing a Zoom. But I think you may have to exaggerate some things like smiling and whatever. I don't know whether you're doing a lot more Zoom interviews.
Yeah, I think it's just very different. But we're doing a lot of things on these platforms. So, and I suppose, I don't know if it's a good thing or a bad thing, but you do see yourself, which of course probably makes you more self-conscious. But you may also then be aware of some of the sort of habits that you have, and the hand gestures, or, you know, if you're very unexpressive, then maybe you need to work on looking enthusiastic, because there's no point sitting there going, I'm passionate about psychiatry, and actually looking like you couldn't care less. So, you know, I think just try and have a good look at what you do and see whether there are things you need to perhaps tweak.
Thank you. We have a question in the chat, and these are 3 related questions from Dr. Helen Lee. And I'll just read that out one at a time. So 3 related questions for Alison and Simon. Thanks for a very useful session on consultant interviews. The first question is, give us an example style of questions do they all have to be work-based examples?
I would say probably not necessarily. So I guess if you don't want to seem like somebody who's not serious about their work, but if you do something significant outside of work that shows you in a good light, say, for example, team working, if you're involved in something outside of work where you're showing a lot of those skills, then I think you could certainly bring that in. You know, it makes you're kind of, a panel will be interested in that. I mean, not trivial examples. There's no point just saying I'm on the Parent Teacher Association and I've run a jumble sale, something like that. But if you're a school governor, say, or you're involved in a charity, or you've been involved in a sporting club, that might be a good example. I guess you don't want to have that as the only thing you're saying about yourself. So you need to have made sure that you're selling yourself in other ways as a professional in the role. But I don't think there are definite exclusions for those.
No, I think it's primarily they should be work examples, but as Alison says, you might have done something big with a charity, and that shows things like leadership and organisation. So, thinking about stuff outside that really might, tick off a few personal specifications. Yeah.
Okay. The second question is, are there any absolute no-nos of things you would talk about in terms of learning from when things go wrong, or give us an example type questions?
I think that the worst thing, if people are, well, if people say, give us an example of something that went wrong, sitting there looking blankly saying, I don't have an example, nothing ever goes wrong for me, is an absolute no-no. Also, it's not great to have examples where you're really talking about somebody else doing something wrong and you kind of picking up on it and blaming them for something that happened. So, I think you need to show that you learned from it, not necessarily just by somebody else's mistakes. But I think the main thing is to show that you're reflective and that whatever happened, as long as it wasn't completely disastrous and didn't end you up in court, that you learnt from it yourself, that you maybe changed your practice in some way, or that you shared it with your team. So I think it's just, showing your approach really, and you as a reflective clinician.
Yeah.
And the last question in this chat from Dr. Lee, on example-based questions again, when doing your interview preparation, if there is a really good example that fits more than one characteristic, is it okay to use it for both? Or would there be a chance that you would be asked two separate example-based questions at the interview and look a bit narrow in your experience?
I think you shouldn't use the same, ideally you shouldn't use the same example, I think, in two different questions, but it may be that when you're answering one question, it will tick off for the interviewers different personal specifications. So ideally, I think make sure you try and use a different example. Alison?
I mean, I think there is a risk. So if you've prepared one absolutely amazing example that maybe shows team working and something that went wrong, they might ask you both things. And so I think it's probably good not to use the same example in that case. So maybe to have something in reserve if they do ask you both. It's a bit unusual that they would ask two things in quite the same way, but I think it's good to have more than one string to your bow. So to have a couple of things. I mean, the thing, it is quite a common question, something that's gone wrong or something that didn't go to plan or something, that you were involved in that you've learned from. And you may have one absolutely brilliant example of that, but if there's something, say, to do with team working or dealing with a conflict in a team or a colleague that you don't get on with, then I think it's probably a good idea to have something else that you've kind of thought about, so that you're not stumped if you've already used your good example in another question, because they might ask you something in a slightly different way, so you don't want to be repeating yourself.
Thank you. And one last question for both of you, and that is some tips. So how should I structure my answers in an interview?
Yeah. I mean, it's a big part of preparation, and I think it's not just important for the sort of the answer itself, but it says a lot about you, because how you answer questions will touch on things like communication skills, like organization. So there is the structure itself, but also there are it will vary depending on the type of question. So something where you're asked about a generic skill like teaching or communication skills, there is a specific structure, as opposed to, say, if it's a scenario where you're asked about, worried about a colleague's performance. So that'll be there's a different sort of structure for a scenario, which I can mention later. But as in the talk, the main elements of the structure, I think it's really important, is to have these 3 key themes that you hang everything around, so that you don't go off at a tangent and you keep on topic. And so if it's something like teaching, you might say, I'm going to talk about it in terms of undergraduate, postgraduate, multidisciplinary. And you sort of signpost that at the beginning or as you're going through. So there's those 3 key themes, the signposting, and then I think the structure needs to move quite quickly from being sort of dry and general to selling yourself, to the sort of specific and the personal, because the 2 underlying questions that they're looking at is why you and also why us. So I think it's also like in the cask, is you must answer the question that's being asked. So if it's something like, tell me about your communication skills, don't start giving an essay on what communication skills are important. You need to talk about what's important to you, your style, and personal examples. And this is where you need to really think about before the interview. Lots of examples for different questions, which involves you, which puts you in a good light. Ideally, where there was a sort of positive outcome, and have a store of examples for each one, because it sets you apart from a lot of people who just give very dry, generic answers. I think that's for the sort of the general sort of skills question. I think I mentioned before this scenario. So, for example, a colleague that you're worried about. So there's an acronym, some people know about this in a lot of books, called SPIES, which stands for seeks information, thinking about patient safety, what initiatives, what have you done about it, what approaches you've done, do you need to escalate or not, and sort of what support is around. So I think, you really think throughout when you're structuring it, how can I sell myself best? How can I give lots of examples or examples that really sort of include the answer, and sets you apart a bit from the average person. So it's answering the actual question, sticking with these themes and talking around them, and also, as I mentioned a lot in the talk, practicing it, because you don't want to say your first question in the interview and realize it doesn't sound right. So practicing it, practicing that structure in front of the mirror, and thinking constantly about these questions. What is it about you? Why should we get you? And that only really comes from you telling them about yourself and getting to know who you are by what you've done, as well as also knowing about the trust you're applying to and what you might do for them. Yeah, so it's working on that basic structure. If Alison wanted to add anything.
I think just, if you're going to use a framework and a structure, to try and stick to it. So don't say I'm going to discuss 3 points and then only get to the end of 2 and stop, because that kind of gives a bad impression. And I think, it's great to use a structure, but don't be sort of robotic about it. So don't answer every question saying I'm going to structure my answer, blah, 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 in a way that just comes across as sort of over rehearsed. I think that's the difficulty, really. You can sometimes just seem like you're almost reading a script. So, do use a structure if that's helpful and it's relevant to the question, but in a way that's sort of more like having a conversation than just trotting something out that you've practiced.
Yeah, that's a good point. So you could signpost in different ways at the beginning, middle, and end, and vary it slightly. Yeah, not to sound robotic, and to be flexible within your answer, because it may be that the answer you prepared is slightly different from the one that they're asking. Yeah.
Thank you. I know I said it was the last question, but there's another one in the chat, and I wonder whether I'm able to quickly sneak that in. And that is about service user in the interview panel and how sensitive the examples need to be. So if you're able to just give some quick tips around that, that'd be fantastic.
Yeah, I mean, trusts do vary a lot in how much service user input they have. And I've been to some panels where they've had a separate service user panel and a service user on the appointments panel, and others where they don't seem to involve service users at all. So there's quite a wide range, and it's worth knowing in advance what to expect. And obviously you do need, I mean, the service users they will have on panels are people who've had training for this. They're not going to be people who are acutely unwell, but obviously there are sensitivities about what you need to talk about and how you need to answer their questions, and very obvious things like not using a lot of jargon, not being condescending or patronizing to service users or carers who are asking you the questions. But I think they will expect you to answer things in a reasonably sort of sensible and robust way. You don't have to be walking on eggshells, but you just need to be aware of the types of issues that may concern them much more than other people on the panel. And I think what's often really interesting is at the end of a panel or a service user sort of separate event is, the main question is, do you want this person to be your consultant? Do you trust them to be your doctor? And that's a bit different from what the rest of the panel are looking for. But obviously, the ideal situation is that the panel thinks that candidate X is ideal for the job, and the service users agree, because it's so important that we get both things right.
Thank you so much for that. And again, if there are any other questions, please do add them on to the chat. And we have our next speaker. Thank you for waiting, Dr. Rachel Gibbons. I see her there. She's a consultant psychiatrist and a medical psychotherapist, and we have a couple of questions for you.
Okay.
The first two are kind of related, so I'll just read them out, and that is about most of us work in teams that are understaffed, poorly resourced, and consultant psychiatrists end up holding a lot of risk on our own. And how do we go about managing our anxiety caseload and prevent compassion fatigue and burnout? And that is linked into the risk. And the second part of it is again linked with the blame, because I mean, this was a part of your talk that no one is to blame for the event, but we can as clinicians be blamed, and what can we do about this?
Okay, so maybe I'll start with the first question. And I was thinking about this idea that as a consultant, you can be left on your own with a risk. I think that's a perception. And I think when you perceive that you're on your own with a risk, that's a sign that maybe you've stepped a bit into something, because you're not on your own with a risk. The whole way we function, particularly working within the NHS, the whole way the NHS functions is on teams and groups. So if you're feeling on your own, then there's a reason you're feeling on your own. And I think that probably needs to be thought about perhaps how the team is functioning, and who is it you can share this with. Both in the setting itself, because if you're functioning part of the team and the team is holding that risk, I suppose what it might indicate is there's a bit of a dependency going on within the team. There's sort of dependency functioning with you in a leadership role, and that's maybe something worth having a bit of a think about, because that's never a healthy place to be, because you end up carrying more than you can possibly carry. So there might be a part of you unconsciously volunteering for that. So I think that's very important, but I think it's also important to say the consultant does have an important role in thinking about it, in thinking about this. I think you have a very important role in demonstrating compassion, and that nobody is to blame. If you start feeling you're to blame or somebody else is to blame, then that sort of will go down in the way that leadership does throughout the team. So I think it's very important to think about, you're not alone, you're never alone. If you're feeling alone, it's a state of mind, and perhaps you need to have a think about that and think what support you need, and to sort of engage with your team, but also what support you might need yourself, and that to think about how to build in reflective places with your team. When we get busy, we also tend to retreat and feel very much on our own, and it becomes very difficult. One of the most difficult things I've struggled with in my career is trying to bring in reflective spaces to teams, because everybody's too busy. But it's actually one of the most healthy things you can do, to bring in these reflective spaces. And then when something happens, you also have spaces that are built into the structures to reflect with your teams. And the second part of that is about blaming, about the sort of nature of the blame. Now, the thing with blaming is a non-mentalizing word. It comes out of a non-mentalizing state of mind. So people who've been working within mentalization services will know a bit about mentalizing and not mentalizing. But when your mind is overwhelmed by anxiety, you go into what's called black and white thinking. If you're thinking about cognitive sort of behavioral therapy, it's the way that they sort of describe this. It's either this or it's that. And blame is a word that comes out of that state of mind. So blame implies there is one thing, one person who holds everything. And that's not in any way the case. So if people are using the word blame, it means they are not mentalizing. If you're using the word blame in your own head, it means your mind is not mentalizing and you're not thinking. Nobody can possibly be to blame for anybody else's death. Yeah, and in a complex system, suicide in itself is incredibly complex. We don't know why it happens in any case, but also we work within very complex systems, multi-layered groups, teams. There can never be one thing. And even if there was one thing, which there isn't, we wouldn't know which one it was. So it's a sort of slightly delusional mentality to think that we do. So I would say there's something about challenging that non-mentalizing that we all have to take some responsibility for. So contributing to cultures where we don't actually use the word blame, and if blame comes up, it gets challenged, and we try and use perhaps more mentalizing words such as responsibility. But it's a big challenge because we're in quite persecutory cultures. Generally, globally at the moment.
Thank you. Before I go on to the next question, I've noted in the chat comment to Rachel from a delegate. Thank you for the leaflet. I found it extremely helpful and informative. Thank you so much. The next question is, can you elaborate more about suicide resulting from human condition and not a mental health condition?
So the majority of people who die by suicide happen, over sort of 73% of deaths by suicide occur in the population that have not had contact with mental health services in the last year. I think there's something we can do in mental health services, which is to sort of claim that suicide is ours and it's just associated with mental illness. So somehow it belongs to us, which is just so not the case. That this is it's part of the human, probably part of human nature, and it happens within many people who have had no diagnosis and no engagement with mental health services at all and no history. And I was just hearing from someone who works within services that work, in the front line with people who are suicidal, and they were saying that an awful lot of the cases of people who are either attempting suicide or completing suicide are those who've been diagnosed with serious physical injuries or have just had a relationship breakdown. So this is a response, suicide, a serious attempt at suicide, and suicide itself appears to result from loss events and not from mental illness. And mental illness can be one of those events, but I think that's very important to say that this is a public health responsibility. It's not a mental health responsibility, and it's not our job. I don't feel, this is speaking from my own heart, I don't feel it's our job in psychiatry to predict and prevent suicide, because I don't think there's any evidence that you can do that in any individual case. So it's a sort of perversion of what our role really is, which is to provide care and enhance someone's developmental capacities and well-being. And that in itself is quite likely to prevent some deaths by suicide. But to turn that our job is to predict and prevent something we can't do, sets us up to fail. And then when a death by suicide happens, then we think, well, it must be something we've done because we should have predicted it and prevented it.
Thank you. And that's why when it comes to, when you hear about the Zero Suicide Initiative kind of rolled out across the trust, there is that whole feeling of, oh dear God, how are we going to kind of manage that? Thank you. And the one last question, I am aware of the time and we've got two other speakers, is a bit more information about the suicide group for consultants. And I wonder whether there is a resource or something you could signpost us to.
Well, I can certainly signpost you to our new, so we've got a new working group at the Royal College, the effects of suicide and homicide on consultants. We've got a new web page. There's a consultant suicide group that I've been running for the last 12 years in a trust, and we're actually going to start one online at the Royal College for psychiatrists throughout the UK. So I think that's probably for people to be held in mind. So the way to access that group, if you've had a death by suicide and you want some support, and we're just starting, we're going to pilot that in a couple of weeks, but then we'll be running it once every 2 months, will be to contact the psychiatrist support service.
Okay.
So if you want to come to that group and have a discussion, if you're feeling overwhelmed by a death by suicide, then do feel that there is a lot of help and support around, and this is just one extra bit.
Lovely. Thank you so much for your time. That was absolutely fantastic. Now moving on to Dr. Jeff Marston.
Hi.
Hello, good to see you again. It's been a year. And there are a couple of questions for you, Jeff. The first one is from Dr. Paul Gallagher. And he said, I've completed training and been appointed to a substantive consultant with only 2 years out of training. So far, I've found supervising more junior colleagues who are older than me to be quite challenging due to the discrepancy in our life experiences and clinical experiences. Do you have any advice on how to navigate this best?
Okay, that's a good question, actually. As a mentor and coach, I would never give advice, but I will talk in ways that hopefully to make things a bit clearer. If you go back to sort of the talk, Clutterbuck and Meggerson, they gave 3 roles of the mentor. The first was being an elder statesman, which I'm guessing from what the question is that you don't feel you're that elder statesman. But what I would say is that in that role, you do have your own experiences, and you may be one step ahead of the person that you're being a mentor for. So, for example, if you're mentoring a trainee, they may be older than you, they may have more life experiences than you, but they haven't been a consultant yet. So you may have like 2 years experience of how what it's like to be a junior consultant that they won't have, or they may have changed career from being a GP to a psychiatrist. So you may have other skill sets that they don't necessarily have. The second role that they talk about is being a reflective practitioner, and that sort of ties in very much with a few of the previous questions and speakers as well. So that's within your skill set as a psychiatrist to support a reflective space. And if you go to the slide of Roger's as well, the key thing in a mentoring relationship is the relationship. Without a good relationship, it isn't going to work. So empathy, genuineness and respect, bringing that into a reflective space can be very powerful. And the third area that they talk about is being a coach. So again, a coach doesn't necessarily need experience within that person's workspace or sport or whatever, but they will just bring the set of skills that a coach has that we also have as psychiatrists in sort of being able to help them analyze and look at the situation from different angles to make their own choices. So we're giving them the roadmap of how they could get things done, not telling them what to do. Okay, so I hope that is helpful, but and isn't advice, but they may be useful things to think about.
Lovely, thank you for that. And obviously, if there are more questions, delegates, do put them in the chat. And I suppose the one other question I have for you, Jeff, is what mentoring experience was of most influence to you? So if you're able to quickly address that one, that would be
okay, right. There's been a few examples over the years that I would bring to mind. I mean, one particular time was really in my very junior days of being a consultant, being a sort of a trainee psychiatrist. So unfortunately, my supervising consultant had a heart attack on the day I was meant to start in my first senior registrar post, as was then. So at that time, I had a clinical supervisor, which was one of the consultants locally as well. But I also had another person that I could go to sort of for the non-clinical bits as well. So actually giving me space to talk through what it's like to suddenly be an acting up consultant for a year, running a team and learning very quickly on the job. I'm not sure these things would happen nowadays, but they did in that day. So actually having somebody to have that reflective space about being the sort of a de facto leader of a team when you didn't feel ready for it was very helpful, and that got me through, and also got me thinking about life sort of career choices as well, about sort of, you know, whether or not I wanted to be an academic consultant sort of roles within the college, those sorts of things. So it brought out a lot of thinking for me and opportunities that I've since pursued during my career.
Thank you so much for that. I mean, that's all the questions we have, but appreciate you joining us today.
Okay. Well, thanks for the offer of coming along to join you. Take care now.
Thank you. And I'm aware of the time, and I know the last bit, Marjan, Dr. Marjan Ghazirat, are you in there?
Hi, Sharada. Yes, I'm here.
Hello. And this one is a question on our talk based on setting up a local StartWell event. So we'll try and be quick. And it was around, would the scheme address unrealistic clinical pressures placed upon consultants, there being a risk of being expected to become resilient to handle pressure? So do you have any thoughts on that at all?
Yeah, thank you very much. I know that everyone is just like waiting to finish because it's at the end of the talk, but I've just tried to be very quick. Yeah, it's a very good question. I think it is important for us to understand about like how much pressure is actually expected for a consultant, and no matter how resilient you are, sometimes the pressure is beyond your resilience, so you need to think about it. That's why I think within our StartWell group, we use that making connection like part of the Royal College of Psychiatry StartWell pillar information. So it is important that know that you're not alone. So what we do in our StartWell induction, that saying that we are like as a StartWell core group are there to support them and help them to signpost them to different facilities that are available within the trust. For example, peer support group, ballot groups, or even StartWell core group as well, or mentoring scheme. So if anyone is under pressure, they can come to us and talk about it, and we can signpost them or like let them know what is available. So the key issue, the key issue here is just making sure that a new consultant know that they are not alone within the trust, and they can reach out for a support whenever they need to. So I think that can make a good impression for a new consultant to be able to feel supported.
Yeah, and just to add on to that, I think we've been quite clear that, you know, it's at the end of the day, it's a support, and within the well-being aspect, it's about knowing our limits and being assertive and being quite clear what we are able to and not do. So I think it's important to recognize that it isn't something that, you know, you can do the StartWell and use it as a support and then kind of just cope with unrealistic pressures, because that would just end up in kind of, you know, burnout in the long term. Again, I'm very aware of the time, and we've got so many alternative commitments. So I would need to bring this meeting to a close, but I did want to add that if there are questions and queries that come out of today's discussion, please could you send them by email, because they would be passed on to the speakers and we will get back to you. But I wanted to say a huge thank you to all the speakers and all the delegates. I do hope that you have enjoyed and found this event useful and helpful, and we really value your feedback because we base our future events and topics based on what you tell us. So I hope you're able to fill the form out and send it to us, and hope to hear from you all soon. Thank you. Bye.